We're now starting our third panel, which is focused on advances in atrial fibrillation technology and treatment. This session is moderated by Carri Chen, PhD, John A. Howard Professor of Business, and Faculty Director, Healthcare and Pharmaceutical Management Program at Columbia Business School. We have three panelists. Lawrence Biegelsen, Managing Director of Medical Supplies and Devices, Corporate Investment Banking at Wells Fargo. Joe Fitzgerald, MBA, Executive Vice President and Group President, Cardiology at Boston Scientific. Elaine Wen, MD, Easter Abudi Associate Professor of Medicine in Cardiology and Cardiac Electrophysiology at Columbia Irving Medical Center. She's also an attending physician at New York Presbyterian Hospital.
All right, well, to get us started, atrial fibrillation is now the most common type of abnormal heart rhythm, and researchers estimate that around 12 million people in the US by 2030 will have AFib. Recent studies also show that it's arising in younger people, elite athletes in their 20s. So just to provide some level setting to get the conversation going, I would love to start with Dr. Wan. If you could give a brief introduction to atrial fibrillation and the current standard of care.
Right. Well, first, thank you so much for staying to the end for us as panelists, and thank you for the Columbia Business School for this opportunity for the medical school and business school to sort of work together on this. So atrial fibrillation is an irregular heart rhythm. So first, let me describe who I am. I tell my patients, if you think of the heart as a house, there's a general contractor for the house, there's a plumber, and there's an electrician. And I'm the electrician for the house, for the heart. So let's start by that. And there are irregular rhythms in the heart. And sometimes it could be because the house is getting old. So the plumbing is faulty, electrical system is faulty. And sometimes the wiring was just born abnormal, so you have issues. And sometimes when you stress it too much on the wiring, you have abnormalities. So atrial fibrillation is an irregular rhythm. Sometimes people feel it, and sometimes people don't feel it. And what we definitely know is as patients get older, and if we're all lucky enough to get older, when you have certain medical problems like high blood pressure or coronary disease, you tend to get electrical issues such as atrial fibrillation, and it could lead to problems such as stroke if you're not on a blood thinner, heart failure, and now we're learning that it can also lead to dementia and early decline of neurovascular function. So if you want me to describe what atrial fibrillation is, there's been a lot of discussion about the science of it, and basically people have thought it's been described in the past as sort of like a bag of worms or a hurricane in the heart. And the ways to treat it are either an ablation, which is where we burn away the abnormal electrical area. So I try to describe it as if you have a pool and you have 4 students or 4 people around the pool throwing rocks into the pool, there will be ripples. Okay, so how would you prevent the ripples from spreading in the pool? And the way to do it is to basically build a moat around everybody, right? So that when they throw pebbles into the water, the ripples don't permeate through the pool. So that's sort of what AFib ablation does. But of course, there's other things such as medication. And then I think that what we're going to talk about today is the technology for atrial fibrillation. So I'll stop here.
Great. Well, speaking of technology, I'm going to go to you, Joe. And the last 12 months has been really quite exciting with the advancement in AFib treatments. Boston Scientific had your pulse field ablation device approved by the FDA. Could you share what you're most excited about with this new technology, and how do you think it will change the care trajectory going forward?
Yeah, I think to put that in, and thank you for the invite, and look forward to the questions. The way to think about it is the field of electrophysiology, which really goes back probably 50 years, but the treatment, which was largely for, call it the mainstream last 30 years, what Dr. Wan talked about was thermal ablation, either using RF energy to create heat to destroy particular regions of the heart, or cryoablation, which uses extreme cold temperatures to block those areas that you want. This new field, which actually was in existence for 30 plus years, is what we call electroporation or pulse field ablation. And we've been approved, several companies have been approved in Europe for the past 2 or 3 years. Both of the current approvals, now there are 4 approved in the US, but only 2 technologies have been available for the last year. The exciting part of this is electroporation is non-thermal. RF is hot, cryo is cold, to the extent it can damage cardiac tissue, and it can also damage adjacent tissues like key nerves and or the esophagus that lays right behind the heart. So PFA offers similar efficacy, i.e. the ability to stun parts of the heart, permanently stun, but without the downside. So we've seen quite a dramatic uptake of this non-thermal for 2 reasons. Number 1, you avoid particular safety issues. And number 2, it has the promise and the clinical data to say it's as good, it's as efficacious as the mainstay heat and cold that has been used for the past 30 years.
It's an exciting time, and I think it's on theme with a lot of what we've been talking about today in terms of the new technology really reducing risks for patients. Larry, you've been following this very closely, and in addition to Boston Scientific, Medtronic has a PFA device. J&J's device just got approved last week. What do you think are the most exciting things that are to come in the next, let's say, 6 months that we should be looking out for?
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for having me here. I would say 2 things. One is just how the competitive landscape evolves. J&J just got approval for Varipulse, I think a week ago. Medtronic got approval for their second device called Affera, which is interesting technology. To this point in the US, it's been Boston Scientific with Varipulse, and Medtronic with a technology called Pulse Select. So the next 6 months are going to be really interesting to see how the competitive landscape evolves. First. Second is also I wanted to bring in another treatment option for atrial fibrillation patients, which is left atrial appendage closure. And tomorrow we're going to see the results from a trial sponsored by Boston Scientific called Option, which is looking at using in patients undergoing ablation for atrial fibrillation, looking to see if you could also implant a Watchman device, which is the Boston Scientific LAA closure device, to replace anticoagulation or blood thinners. And the reason that's important is a lot of patients after ablation still need to be on anticoagulation for life. And there's a bleeding risk associated with that accumulates over time. So we're really excited to see, the results from that tomorrow. And we're very bullish on the atrial fibrillation ablation market, which right now is about $10 billion, growing over 20%. And the left atrial appendage closure market, which is about $2 billion, which we think it could grow to $6 billion by 2030. So, those are 2 areas that I would highlight.
Do you want to add a little bit on the sneak peek, or are we going to have to wait until tomorrow to?
No, I would. I think in my career we violated 1 embargo, so I'm not going to do the second one today.
Fair enough. But Dr. Weiner, I was thinking maybe you could share a little bit that we now have these technologies that are coming in. There have been some that existed and with some risks associated with it. How are you seeing this affecting kind of the way that you're treating your patients going forward? And kind of what's the pathway to the adoption of these new devices for you?
Well, thank you so much for Boston Scientific, J&J, MedTech, and Medtronic for bringing new technologies to the forefront for us as physicians to use technology to advance the care for our patients. And I think it's a good collaboration of advancing technology in medical care. So I definitely agree with what Joe said, is that there's less risk. So and also the process or the workflow of the ablation is, and I don't want to magnify this, but it is more efficacious. I don't want to say faster, it's more efficacious. And it allows us to do more in a more efficient manner for our patients. So prior, when like Joe was saying that when there was something called radiofrequency ablation, we were worried about the esophagus. We'd have to use other tools to deviate the esophagus when we were concerned about the injury. And now we have to not be concerned about such things. I think that it's true to talk about is that it is as efficient as radiofrequency ablation in those trials. And we're looking forward to using this technology for patients who need it and also expand it for other uses, other types of arrhythmias. I think the big question here is, how is this going to affect our workflow as physicians? And I think one of the questions that it's helpful to have a diverse audience here is talking about public health and payers for this. So there are only a certain number of operators. You might make more hammers, but there's the same number of people using it and the same amount of time it takes for you to hammer something in. So I think that's one of the issues. As a physician scientist, my also concern is that we're building bigger hammers for nails, but we don't know why the nails turned up in the first place. So as a scientist, I think we need to understand, why does atrial fibrillation occur? And instead of just having technology that is destructive, electroporation, although it came in the age of using plasmid DNA to be incorporated into cells, we're using in an irreversible manner. I like to think about regeneration or improving heart tissue in a certain way. I'm not saying that it doesn't have benefits, but if we can further advance this technology for other uses in the future. I think that when we try to say we can do more and more for physicians, then people such as insurance might start to cut the payment for payers. And that's why for the Heart Rhythm Society, American Heart Association, we've tried to work hand in hand with the technology companies to not advertise necessarily the efficiency, but really the outcomes, like the less risks for the patient and why we're using that. So I think that's important to talk about.
Yeah, I think maybe building on this efficacious aspect of it, there's lots of estimates that the number of patients who actually have AFib or are being diagnosed with it is severely underestimated. And so first, what can we do to identify them? But then what are the implications? So we heard a little bit from the provider side, but I also will kind of go to the rest to understand that. Maybe let's start with just, how do we identify these patients that need care and that are eligible for these new tech devices that are coming in?
Yeah, I'll talk about it quickly because I was sitting in on the previous panel, and I think it was very interesting where you had Epic and other groups talking about identifying more people with AFib and just sending warning signals to physicians. And I think there's another side for, business leaders to think about implementation. For us, Apple Watches, which a lot of people wear now, they signal that there's an irregular heart rhythm. But just think about the implementation of it is that when a patient gets that signal, they're extremely anxious and worried about it. They try to get a call in with their doctor. Then for me to sit down and talk with them what AFib is and what they don't have takes another 15 minutes, right? That's something that, can AI replace that or not? For you, I'm a physician, but I'm also a patient. Everyone here is a patient. Do you want AI explaining this to you, or do you want a person to see face-to-face what this is, And a lot of things about digital health is about trust, right? That's why there's a difficulty implementing to people who are not as educated or financially well off, or their ability to adapt to it. So I think there's some obstructions for a workflow for sort of implementation of AI and digital health for all masses that we have to think about. I mean, the audience here, the panels here, we are well-educated people. So we have different sort of absorption of information, which I think may be different for the masses.
Right. Joe, I'd love to hear your perspective from Boston Scientific. If we're able to identify more of these patients, what can you do? As Dr. Wynn is saying, there's more tools, but how do we ensure that they're actually getting to the patients that need it? And what can you do from the manufacturing side of things?
Yeah, so I think as a medical device manufacturer, whether it be a wearable or an implantable, right? We, the industry, have done a good job of expanding the ability to diagnose arrhythmias. So think of it, someone has a stroke, they had no symptoms before, they didn't even know they had AFib because they're asymptomatic. And when they come in, they're probably then going to get a diagnostic. I agree with Dr. Wen that the proliferation of Apple Watches, et cetera, will go. There's a ton of work being done in AI. So hopefully most people over the age of 50 are getting some type of physical exam each year. And you can even see early technologies that can predict AF just from a normal ECG 12 lead that you will get as part of a regular physical. So 2 points. AFib is extremely underdiagnosed. You know, we like to say there are 12 million, like you said, in the US. There are probably hundreds of millions of patients walking around the globe with silent AF. And we have this inextricable link between AF and eventual stroke as you age, as you get comorbidities. So I think med tech can play a role in the wearable implantable. I think diagnostics, digital health companies can go upstream of that. And then, of course, the other part of our job is what tools can we provide to electrophysiologists, structural heart interventionalists to actually solve the problem.
Right. Larry, as you're kind of projecting forward, given this underdiagnosis, the advances from digital health and the providers to try to address that, and then the med tech organizations to try to fill in those treatments, how fast do you think this market is going to grow? And what do you see as the eventual market size given this landscape?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier on LAA, we have it going from 2 billion to about 6 billion in 2030. So that's about a 25% CAGR. For AF ablation, it's about, it's over 10 billion today, 10 billion in 2024, growing again over 20%. And we see that continuing. I think we have we have a market model. We probably have the market growing 15-20% over the next, 5 to 7 years. So I can't remember the exact number, but everyone here can do the math. The numbers get pretty big. And so right now, those two markets are two of the fastest growing large markets in medical devices. The other one being the panel you had earlier on robotics.
Mm-hmm.
So you have two of the biggest fastest growing areas in medical devices on the program here. But I don't, Joe, what is Boston Scientific's estimates?
It's very similar, plus 20% growth rates for left atrial appendage closure and teens for ablations. The driver of this, and especially for all the Columbia grad school, is you always have to start, as you know, I'm not teaching you anything, with what's the prevalence and the incidence, right? So if you take a rich country like the United States and you dissect that, ablation, which has class 1 indications, Watchman is still at a 2B. Both of those, though, when you look at the prevalence, the pool of patients who have the disease and are indicated and or are reimbursed, both Watchman and ablation are in the, call it 10 to 15% penetration. And you have two things that are happening. Number one, you're going to get more diagnoses and you're going to get expansion of the indicated patient populations in both the ablative world and in the left atrial appendage closure world. So if you say we're at a fairly low penetration, like who gets treated, and you're in the 10 to 15, and that supports Larry and our numbers, that with the continued advancement of technology, of AI, of diagnostics, you have markets that are going to double. And the big question is, will they double in 3, 5, or 7 years? While they're, I'm repeating myself, while they're really underpenetrated today.
Well, I'd love to get the kind of clinical perspective as to why that penetration is still low. And is it from a lack of knowledge standpoint? Is it a hesitation of adoption of new technology? And of given the promise of how much better these new technologies have in terms of better outcomes, reducing risk of complications for patients, is it something that you see in the next 3 years, 7 years? Kind of help us understand a little bit better from the clinical side.
Build on what Joe said is that, recent clinical trials have showed that earlier intervention, once the patient is diagnosed with atrial fibrillation, has shown clear improved outcomes in morbidity, like development of heart failure or stroke. So I think I'm just going to add on that yes, more adoption of this new technology and earlier intervention in patients who have been diagnosed with AFib. And I agree that the adoption of this new wearables and implantable devices will be able to catch more patients who were asymptomatic with atrial fibrillation.
If I could add to that too, because there are a couple of really interesting perspectives. So if you haven't noticed, over the last 10 years, there's a lot more advertising because there are new oral anticoagulants. You see the president of HRS, I think, has done public service ads, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So the awareness of AFib as something that causes many more bad things, up to and including stroke, heart failure, that happen. And yet you still have a very low penetration. So you've got, and this gets into why does Boston Scientific do so much direct-to-patient education, direct-to-refer education? And I remember a point 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, before, right when Watchman was getting approved for left atrial appendage closure as an alternative to long-term anticoagulants, we did a big quantitative market research study, and we used, hundreds of cardiologists. And what we found was 97% of cardiologists knew that there was a device called Watchman, they knew that it had been approved, and they knew what the indications were. When you asked, so these are non-implanting, non-interventional physicians, so general cardiologists. When we asked the question, right after we got the approval, how many of you would recommend a workup for your patient for that? The number was like 3%, right? So yes, it's approved. Yes, there are 2 randomized trials to prevent it. So then we said, okay, we've got to take an active role in digital marketing, digital direct to patient, digital direct to refer, to get the market going. Now you also then have to do large randomized trials. The other really interesting thing, when you think about the power of pharma, it has long been known that of the patients who have been diagnosed and are clearly indicated for an long-term anticoagulation, less than 50% of those patients go on and stay on an anticoagulant, despite like rock solid class 1 evidence that you will have fewer strokes if you stay on an anticoagulant. So that all kind of feeds into the, why do we believe, that this AFib interventional market, right, is got really outstanding growth potential.
Great. You mentioned Watchman, and you also acquired Farapulse in 2021. And so maybe I'll start with Larry, and then I'll go back to you, Joe. But if we think about what kind of the landscape in medtech, many of these large players are developing either in-house or looking to acquire outside. And so what do you see from other companies in terms of their strategies of balancing R&D, in-house development versus acquisitions? And what do you think are some of the factors that make acquisition targets the most desirable?
Sure. So what we've seen in the AFib space is, well, first of all, a lot of M&A. If I go back, it depends how far you want to go back, even Biosense Webster, the market leader, was acquired by Johnson & Johnson. That was like, what, 1995, something like that, Joe? But over the last, call it 5 to 10 years, we've seen more M&A acquisitions we've seen Boston Scientific do a couple. You mentioned Farapulse, Apama, Joe, you remember that one?
Oh, yes. We're bringing that back.
And then there was a cryo one too, so 3. What's interesting is, but we haven't seen, J&J on the ablation side hasn't done much, but they did on the LAA side spend $1 billion to buy a company called Laminar, which when they paid $1 billion for it, had like 40 patients, which is relatively few to spend $1 billion on. On the ablation side, we also saw Medtronic has done a few recently. What's interesting is, and the 2 smaller ones, so it's J&J's number 1 in ablation, then Abbott, And now I think Boston is probably third, but they were a distant fourth before Farapulse and then Medtronic. The smaller ones have done more of the deals. And I think, I'm just speculating, but maybe with J&J, maybe there were concerns about antitrust because their market share is over 50% or was over 50% in the past. So on the ablation side, we've seen probably Medtronic and Boston do more of the deals. On the LAA side, Boston acquired Watchman. I think that was, you said, Joe, 2010, 11. Abbott has an LAA device that they acquired. And then, as I mentioned, J&J just bought one this year or last year. So honestly, this is an area where we've seen a tremendous amount of inorganic, deals.
Yeah, Joe, Larry touched on some of the big successes, but also some of the bumps along the way.
And I think that's important because if you look, if I'll give you the insight into our company, right? So we had we committed to really leading in AFib back in 2005. Okay, it took the better part of 20 years to get the full strategy implemented. We probably did 10 acquisitions. Thank you for pointing it out, Larry. Not all of them were great. Some of them never even made it to market. But I think the message is and think about how underpenetrated and how small really EP in 05. I think the first in man for a left atrial appendage closure device was just made. And now that market was well below 500 million, and it's 10 billion today, 20 years later. So no surprise, you're going to have to make multiple bets. That includes both organic R&D bets and inorganic, and you're going to fail. No one bats 1,000 in med tech M&A. And some of ours were fairly large losses, but some of ours were very big, like Watchman and Farapulse have been outstanding for us. But my point is, strategy, especially in an underpenetrated market, what the mistakes I see from the analyst and the BD and business school is you assume things are going to happen way faster than they actually do. And you assume that you're going to have one magic bullet and you're going to need multiple bullets and multiple guns to attack a market and to grow an underpenetrated market. So timing is always misforecasted, and the amount of risk in what you're doing is always under forecasted.
But you're not talking about this analyst.
No, not our analysts.
Oh, you're internal. Oh, you're not
the people that we hire out of Columbia come in and say, hey, come on, tell us what we should buy and what we should invest more in.
Joe, let me ask you on your view now, looking back, is, you talk about different companies put their, darts on different areas. Let's talk about renal denervation. At that time, all the companies put their chips in that field and all lost. Looking back now, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a great example too, because if you look, when did people start thinking about renal denervation? And that was probably the year 2000. Like, is there some autonomic connection between hypertension, et cetera? The first trials got done in, let's call it the early 2010 to 2015, and most of them failed.
Yeah, let me tell the audience what renal denervation is. So it's thought that, for example, hypertension, right, probably the most common cardiovascular disease that everybody has at some point. And the thought at that time was if you burn around the renal arteries to denervate it, like have no innervation, you would be able to relax the blood vessels. So there was a time period that they thought it was like the golden fleece, that everyone who has hypertension would go get this procedure and they will no longer have to take their blood pressure medication. So that was the background about it.
No, and then so everybody, I usually refer to most things in cardiology are like a knife fight in a phone booth, meaning it's highly competitive. You have big multinationals, and then you have a very large group of VC-funded incubators and companies. So if you look at the 10 years of investment in that space, and then all the clinical data sort of did not meet its endpoints. But then you look, and recently, I hate to give our competitors any credit, but two of our competitors finally got two renal denervation catheters approved to ablate the nerves that surround the renal artery. So now that's 20 years after the first ideas came up. And like Watchman, when it was approved in 2015, these where you have to go, okay, I've got a clinical trial that was positive. I've got a device that was approved, but you do have to go out and educate the referring doctors. Why is this a good thing for your patients, right? To even consider an invasive procedure. So when you look at renal denervation, similar to AFib ablation markets, those are 20 to 30-year strategies because they're complex disease states with all kinds of comorbidities. So it gets back to my point earlier that don't be shocked when some big revolution in med tech and in clinical medicine takes 20 years.
I think this was a theme that came up earlier today too with the robotic surgery of the timeline at which there's starting to get penetration. And Larry, I would just love to get your perspectives as an analyst that doesn't fall under the category of what Joe was alluding to. What are you looking for? Because it's such a long time horizon. Most people, they're thinking about they have to bring value to their shareholders. It's a much shorter time horizon. So what are those things that you can see in the commitment to these longer term strategies, but also balancing that more short term requirements that all of these organizations need to meet?
So when we're analyzing the public companies, we're analyzing new markets, new technology.
Let's start with the public, but then I think also just as they're coming in, the big, large public companies maybe are also trying to evaluate these newer entrants and where there might be synergies. Right?
Yeah, we look at the market size. What's the prevalence, the incidence pool, how big is the market? Is there an unmet clinical need? Then the technology, the clinical data, how de-risked is the clinical data? We look at, we have to evaluate, so the regulatory strategy, the regulatory pathway. A big one, as Joe knows, is also now is the reimbursement, the CMS. We have to think about the reimbursement pathway, and then it's commercial adoption. Does the company have the wherewithal, to launch this technology in the market? Those are the pieces that we look at. Obviously, the competitive dynamics. So I think those are the pieces. Public or private company funding. Obviously, for a private company, access to cash.
Dr. Weiner, I see you nodding, and I think Larry is touching on a couple of things that we had spoken about earlier from the reimbursement landscape and kind of how that impacts the adoption and the use and what the implications are. We heard it come up a number of times today about burnout for our providers.
Right.
And so there's this promise, but how do you think about how everything kind of interacts together in your adoption of new technology?
Think of me as like a pizza maker. Before I was making 10 pizzas, and now Joe's comes out with a faster oven, and then CMS says, "Oh, your faster oven, you can now bake twice the amount of pizzas." So instead of making 10 pizzas now a day, I have to make 20 pizzas to make the same amount that I was earning before the technology of 10 pizzas, right? So now all day long I'm making pizzas, but then I also have all these Apple Watches flaring up, and people are like, "I want more pepperoni," or I want cheese. Why did you have less pepperoni or cheese than before? So I think it's the reality of being a physician that you want to deliver more, and all these technologies are supposed to help you. And they do, but then you end up having to do more. And I think that's one of the limitations. I'm not saying AI can't help. AI can definitely help, like flag, which are high priorities, which are lower priorities. But the plethora of data is a data deluge, which I think for us is the American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology, or Heart Rhythm Society is trying to work with technology, private companies to help us solve these issues. And, Epic is also helpful. The best would be the integration of everything. If Joe's company flags an alert from a device, I read it and Epic automatically bills it. There's a good workflow, that would help us too. So I think there's a lot of space for creativity, people in the audience to help us out, to help doctors deliver better care to patients.
I think the thing I would add to that is if you take the numbers Larry put up there, that means the capacity to do twice the number of procedures in the number of patients in 3, 5, 7, or 9 years has to double. So something has to dramatically change to support that. Because right now, if you said, how many electrophysiologists are we graduating this year, and how many will we be graduating next year? How many cath labs do we have around the world? How many will we have 5, 7 years from now? How many structural heart interventionalists do we have? Those numbers aren't doubling. So something has to change for Dr. Wen to make 20 pizzas a day. And I think that's where technology, the replicatability, the reproducibility, the really tightening of the variability of what can you do in a certain day with a single cath lab that is fully staffed. I'll give you an example. When I entered the field of electrophysiology, most centers would probably schedule 1 AFib per day, because you didn't know if it was going to be a 2-hour procedure or a 7-hour procedure. You know, today, most labs would easily schedule 3, right? Even before PFA. So that's efficiency, that's replicatability, that's the advancement of technologies to help, especially when things go awry in a case. So the capacity issue to support the market, increased market penetration, is a really big macro that you have to analyze, and you have to be right. And then you have to ask yourself, what can I do as a med tech company, or what can the HRS do? What can clinicians do to bend the curve on the capacity? Because the physical capacity is not going to double in that same time frame.
Well, I just want to take this last, few minutes to talk about, as business people, they're saying, well, instead of having Elaine Wan do procedures, I'm going to invent a robot that will make 100 pizzas in a day. So the end thing is, do you want a Pizza Hut pizza, like a regular pizza, or do you want a gourmet pizza when you eat it? And that's up to you as the patient. Do you want just mass production of something where every doctor is the same? Or do you think that there's different strokes for different folks? So I don't think that a pizza is the same thing as a surgery, obviously. So I think that's something else to have in the back of your mind.
Yeah, and I think you keep talking about that there's a lot of different options here, and a lot of med tech companies are coming in with new solutions. And we'd love to just get the perspective of the group on, the last 12 months, 3 big players have introduced kind of similar technology. And so what is the value of competition in this space? And maybe we'll start from the provider's perspective.
I'm going to make it simple. Great. Needed.
Yeah.
Larry, do you want to kind of from the
value of competition? I mean, we heard it from one of the panels earlier, from the robotic panel. I mean, it spurs faster innovation. I mean, when, one truism to me in medical devices is physicians, this is a generalization, they hate, monopolies, right? They want competition, because when you have monopolies in medical devices, the field there's not as much innovation. So I think there's innovation. Now, sometimes you do have, I'll mention it, sometimes more competition does result in lower cost. I would say that's not always the case. It really depends on the number of players, depends on the interchangeability of the technology, how differentiated it is. But it's innovation and potentially lower cost.
Yeah, Joe, from the perspective of the operator, I think you guys, your approval for your PFA device came a month or 2 after Medtronic, and now we know J&J just happened. Do you feel like you're in a rat race? What's your view?
Everything in the cath lab, as I said before, is highly competitive. Monopolies really don't last that long. But I agree with both points. Competition breeds innovation. And in the end, the patient, the hospital systems, and the physicians benefit from highly competitive markets, because what that means is you have big multinationals like the companies that we've been mentioning, and then that fuels the innovation pipeline of the VC-funded world. So I think the link between in big markets where you have strong competition, you can also say you have a demand and really a requirement to drive innovation.
Great. I'm going to ask one last question before we open it up to the audience. And I want to go to Dr. Wan. Just this discussion about preventative care always arises when we think about healthcare. We have skyrocketing costs. It's not an area that this country has been very good at focusing on. But with new drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy, it's possible that treatment with these drugs are going to impact the prevalence of AFib and other cardiac diseases. And so I want to understand a little bit better, how do you think about preventative care, and what do you think the long-term impact of this kind of new arisen focus on preventative care may have on these types of devices and procedures that we're talking about going forward?
Well, I'm going to be pro-tech, as I think I've been a attending physician for over a decade now. I'm going to say every time I do rounds, the patients are just getting sicker and sicker. And the reason why is everyone's had a transplant or had some type of cancer, and they all end up having atrial fibrillation, and it becomes harder to treat. So I think that preventative care is absolutely necessary, especially now everything is being digitized. Like Amazon probably knows how much salt you're buying in your Whole Foods grocery, right? So they probably know how much grams of fat you're buying in your grocery list. So I think there's definitely be more detection and data, and that leading hopefully to more therapies for better preventative care. And I think hopefully that will lead to earlier detection and maybe earlier intervention that would lead to less of atrial fibrillation in the patient population. So I think it's going to be both ways, like the number of sicker people are going to be sicker because people are living longer lives. There's better treatment for cancer and other diseases. But I think earlier detection will also lead to detecting a broader patient population, younger patient population with disease.
Great, thanks. I'm going to open up questions to the audience. Can't see anything, so.
Thank you. Alex Richter, I have a question on the topic of diagnosis, that there's a lack of diagnosis. Is that because the standards for who should get screened aren't aggressive enough? Or is the follow through for people conceptually at risk not consistent enough? Like, why are we missing so many patients? Because we have the tools for detecting it in theory, right?
Yeah, I mean, there have been studies that have been done in other countries with nationalized healthcare, right? Like Sweden or in areas in Europe. And there's like incidence and also how much you catch. So obviously younger patients who are healthy probably don't have cardiovascular disease. So you need to focus on the more likelihood to catch the disease. But it's also a very versatile topic because younger patients are more open to digital technology and being screened and being checked. So eventually you will get them. But then it's also how amenable are they to getting treatment for it? For example, I'll tell you, my youngest patients are the hardest to treat because they want to like exercise, go see and stuff, and I tell them you need to either get treatment before you do all those things. And we live in a society now where everything is very impulsive. I want it now. I want to do it now, and it doesn't really work that way in healthcare. I want to be fixed right now. Joe and other companies are building us better technologies to get there, but it still takes some time. So I think that we will be catching more patients, but it depends on who you're targeting to catch.
I have a question regarding investing into medtech products. So when you invested into Watchman, that was before it achieved FDA approval. So I'm curious to hear, what are the different types of pillars that you guys look for when trying to de-risk an investment into a medtech product?
Yeah, there are two basic questions that we ask way prior to investing in a startup or buying a startup. And we use the same two questions for things we develop internally, organically. And that is, what is the strategic fit with one of the any of the 5 or 6 big business segments where we pursue this category leadership strategy? So what is the strategic fit? And then the second question is, what is the financial fit? Because if you buy something that is never going to hit the standard of what our corporate goals are for operating margin expansion, et cetera, that's a bad financial fit. If you buy something, or if you're looking at something where you answer the questions like, do you have an existing relationship with that physician? Do you have a channel into that physician? Or do you have to build a whole new channel and relationship with a different physician? That's where the strategic fit starts to get lower rather than higher. So if we're buying something, as an example, we just announced on last Monday that we're buying a next generation complex AFib mapping tool. So if I take that announcement and say, oh, are we in electrophysiology? Yes. Are we fully committed to arrhythmia management, arrhythmia diagnostics? Yes. Do we have a cardiac mapping system? Yes. Do we have a diagnostics business that deals with arrhythmias? Yes. Can we sell it right through the same channel that we sell our mapping, our Watchman, and our ablation portfolio through? Yes. So that one got like an A+ on strategic fit. There are others that we look at that are more white spacey, where you say, wow, it's not a great strategic fit. It actually might become a completely new pillar for Boston Scientific. An example of that is the field of heart failure. We don't have a heart failure business today. We treat heart failure patients with CRTDs and BiVs, et cetera, but we don't have an intimate relationship with the general cardiologist or the heart failure cardiologist around the world. So those are the two big things that we try to answer up front before we do all the work. And even though we do that, and then we spend 6 more months analyzing, we still make mistakes with things that are high strategic fit and strong clinical or financial fit. And a lot of times the mistake is made because the device or the technology is hard to get across both the regulatory or the reimbursement goal lines.
Hi, Steve Brooks, Brooks MedTech. I don't have a question as much as a comment. There's a lot of Columbia Business School students here. I was a cardiologist, interventional and general cardiologist. I worked at FDA. I was a medical officer for all of the renal denervation products early on before Simplicity failed. And that's a great example. And my comment here had to do with shifts of capital and understanding baseline data. So when the preliminary studies were done and every single device that you put into a renal artery, it was magic. Blood pressure dropped 25, 30 millimeters mercury. There seemed to be minimal side effects. When Medtronic went into their pivotal trial, it's now a Harvard Business School case study on what went wrong. They changed their device. They targeted physicians that were less experienced than the physicians that were using it in the feasibility trials. There are 20 different reasons that trial failed. And when it did, all this great overexuberance for renal denervation, where a single procedure could treat non-compliance in patients who were prone to long-term chronic disease and stroke, all the money went out. And if you look at the data, there are a lot of really good reasons why that trial failed. And the follow-on effect was that all of the money got out of renal denervation. Smaller companies failed or went long. It took 7 or 8 years to actually recover. So my comment on that is, understand the data, the basic data. Don't follow the pundits that are talking, and continue to fund innovation based on fundamentals. My other comment I was hoping to make, you mentioned Watchman, Joe, when it first came out, and how there was such awareness of what it did and the indications for it, but no adoption. So just like, the first model year of a car, you don't want to buy it until you see what goes wrong. There was interesting data in the pivotal trials early on about complication rates of perforation and the large user curve for, learning it for physicians. Physicians need to learn it. Now that is, minimized. Generation 2 and 3, the safety is incredibly better. So, so my comment to that is, understanding expectation to roll in the initial data when something comes through FDA is enough to get through that bar. A bootstrap small startup isn't going to be able to do a wide-ranging clinical trial. Maybe a Boston Scientific or a Medtronic, a large company can. If you can build in clinical outcomes to understand where this new technology is going to fit into standard of care, competing technologies, when you hit the market, when you finally get through FDA and now you can start your sales, you can increase that ramp and increase your adoption. So my comment would to be more purposeful clinical trials, bringing in more useful endpoints. So sorry,
No, I agree with that, because you can't be in interventional medicine, especially in cardiology, and claim you've never had failures. So the key there, whether you talk about renal denervation or even left atrial appendage closure or electrophysiology, is can you understand why you failed? So you might do a new ablation catheter, and you might go and do a first-in-man or an early feasibility study. You might do a new structural heart mitral valve. The question is, why did you fail, right? What was it about the patient, the patient's anatomy, the patient's condition, the device, the delivery system, the operator? I think in the case of renal denervation, there were like multiple hypotheses on why it didn't work. In left atrial appendage closure, we've had multiple devices that we thought, hey, it's going to launch in Europe in 2015, slam dunk, and the device fails its chronic animal study. Or you get it across the goal line, you go out and do a very limited market release, and the device doesn't perform exactly as all the engineers had convinced us. So I think the point there is you got to run better clinical trials, you got to do better bench, you got to do better animal to identify what are the Achilles heels of a particular product or a procedure, or is there a bigger learning curve that you expected for the actual physician who's treating the patient? So I think understanding that you can overcome failures. We do it all the time. It's really hard when you say, I have no idea why we failed. Like, I don't know if it's the patient, the doc, the device, the market spec that marketing wrote 7 years ago. So, but when you can understand that, you can throw money and people at it. And in partnership with physicians, you can figure it out.
Weiner.
I have a question for Dr. Wen. So you mentioned that your young patients are the hardest to treat among other patients. So a question to follow up on that. So as a physician, when you prescribe a diagnostic test, I would assume, efficacy and accuracy are the the most important standards when you're prescribing that. But do you see for young patients, like let's say when you prescribe a stool-based test versus a blood-based test, do you see a trend among young patients that they care the most about convenience instead of accuracy and efficacy?
No, I don't think so. I need to clarify why I say that my youngest patients are the hardest to treat. To be honest, they have the best outcomes. Because if you catch their atrial fibrillation early, then you ablate them, then they do very well for many years because they don't have other confounding underlying health issues such as blood pressure issues or coronary disease. Why I say they're the most difficult to treat is that they don't want to do procedures, which I totally understand. If I were 18, I wouldn't want to do a procedure either, even though they have better outcomes. And everyone wants everything at once, right? You want cheap, you want fast, and you want to be high accuracy, but sometimes it doesn't always work that way. And as a physician, I just need to hold their hand. It's really called hand holding to walk them through the process. And they need more hand holding than like one of my poorer patients in an urban area who I said, just take this pill. And they're like, okay, so it's a different mindset. And I totally understand a younger patient doing this. And also, they adopt more, such as digital health, like Apple Watch. So every time their Apple Watch flashes something wrong, their stress levels are through the roof. And they're so used to texting or messaging, they'll send me like 5 messages and I'll be like, look, it was just artifact because you were running on your treadmill and the sensors were no good. And that happens all the time with my colleagues and myself. The younger patients are more reactive to these messages. And not that it's a bad thing, but it's just the way things are. But no, I don't think that they would sacrifice convenience or sacrifice accuracy for convenience. Yeah.
All right, well, I think we are just at time. So we've had a really wonderful conversation over this day. I want to invite Kevin Dreyer up from Gabelli Funds to close out the day.
Thank you. Excuse me. I'm Kevin Dreyer, co-CIO of Value at Gabelli Funds. I just want to thank you, Carri, as well as all of our panelists and everyone here in the room, as well as on the Zoom for participating. I note that our teammates are all available to you both afterwards as well as for follow-up. And I'd also note that in addition to looking at everyone's physical health, we of course focus on financial health. We host a number of conferences through the year. Our next one is on 852B6 right here in the Paley Center that deals with some tax dynamics for funds. And we have others throughout the year. The next one is the Pump Valve Motor Conference on February 27th. And with that, I will just invite up our chairman and CIO, Mario Gabelli.
Yeah, thank you all for. I hear things apart all the time. It's part of my practice. Thank you to the individuals at our firm before I thank all of the participants. Thank you, Joe, for all you're doing, Dr. Wan. And Carri is a colleague at Columbia Business School, and we're delighted that we participate and planning it right now. Right now, we're planning for our 7th conference. So hold your heart. Steady. Today you heard Jeff Jonas, who joined us about 20 years ago, cover certain areas. Jeff did not go to Columbia. I show you politically correct. Daniel Barasa did not go to Columbia. He went to school in Cambridge. The one you constantly talk about at Harvard, at our Columbia meeting. Then Elena is here and Carri. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. And enjoy the comments, enjoy the intensity, enjoy the passion. And for those of you in the medical profession, thank you for all you're doing for so many as the first responders. So thanks very much to the doctors and the dentists. Thank you.